Okay, I guess we'll get started. First slide. So yes, here are our overviews. So you will see these are the things that we're going to be talking about. This is not completely comprehensive. There are going to be things that we gloss over, things that we miss out, because I literally do not have enough time. But I'm going to touch on the major points of things that I have done or people that I know closely have done, and give you an idea of what you can use to make your costumes fancy. Okay, next slide. And if you guys have any questions at any point, just I will clarify. If you need us to pause so you can screenshot something, let me know. Okay, so how to choose what you want to do. A lot of it comes down to what you are putting the embellishments onto. Some fabrics have different weight and different drape, and so depending on what you want to add to it, you have to take that into account. So if you have a very soft, flowy fabric, if you want to put something very dense and detail-heavy onto it, it's going to affect how that fabric moves. So you might have to change your plans of what you want to make that design out of. So those are the things you have to keep in mind. Also, how big is the motif that you're trying to do? If you have this huge area on your sleeve that you want to embellish, but the sleeve is chiffon, you're not going to make that motif out of beads because it's going to weigh a ton and it's going to mess up your chiffon. It's going to drag. It's going to look like crap. So these are you have to evaluate where this is going on your costume, how big it is, how much time you have, because I have spent 2 years embroidering a costume, but I don't recommend it. How closely is it going to be seen? Is this meant for stage? Is it meant to be only seen in photo shoots or up close? One of my first fancy costumes, I hand beaded all of my hems in tone-on-tone beads that were exactly the same shade as the dress, and it looked great from 2 feet away, but you couldn't see any of that detail on stage at all. So think about that. How far are people going to be able to see this? Is any of your work going to be visible? Because you don't want to spend hours and hours and hours on something that nobody's going to be able to see. How much money do you want to spend? Because that is, we are all poor right now. So you want to spend your money wisely. You want to focus your attention and time and money on the things that are going to give you the most bang for your buck, the things that are going to make you happiest, because I do not recommend spending hundreds of hours on embellishments if you don't enjoy it. I enjoy it. I find it very relaxing, but I realize that is not the case for everybody. So again, if some techniques are faster or less of a hassle for you and you find that more fun, go for it. Do not force yourself to spend 500 hours beading if you don't like beading. There is no magic bullet for this is how to win a contest. I've seen people, say, well, I spent, so many hours on this embroidery. I'm like, okay, but A, it didn't turn out very well. And B, did you enjoy it? No? Okay, well then why? So you want to be smart about your choices of how to execute the designs that you want to do. And I've been sort of waffling about writing a book about this, where I would make samples of the same motif in all these different materials, just as an example of what it would look like. If you do this in HTV, if you do this in paint, if you do this in embroidery, if you do this in applique, just as a comparison, because I think that would be valuable? Question mark? But in my copious spare time. Okay, next slide. Okay, so if you are doing any kind of embroidery or beading, it is going to be a whole lot easier if you get decent frames or supports. So the round hoops, those are the ones you can get at Michael's or pretty much anywhere. Those are your basic tools. They are great, but your life is going to be a whole lot easier if you wrap one of those hoops with something grippy like bias tape, twill tape, anything like that, because you will find that fabric tends to slip when you have them in the hoops, especially because right where the tighteny thing is, there's less tension there. And the other thing about hoops is it's hard to keep the fabric on grain because fabric stretches on the bias, and you're trying to stretch it evenly, but it's always going to be shifting a little bit when you have it in a round hoop, which is why I personally prefer to use rectangular frames like the slate frame over there. That's the kind of frame that you use for tambour embroidery. So you don't have to use it for any kind of embroidery. There are a lot of things that you can just do in a handheld hoop, and handheld hoops are really great for projects that you want to bring with you wherever you go. You have a long-term project, you can just bring it on the train, on the bus. You can, do it wherever. Just put it in a little bag and carry it with you. I love those kinds of projects that keep your hand busy. So the round hoops are really, really great for that kind of a project. For larger projects or for tambour embroidery, I prefer the slate frame because the way that the slate frame works is that you see it has those the wide pieces of bias tape twill tape on that's stapled onto those wooden stretchers, and so you basically baste your fabric onto that twill tape, and then because it's basted onto the fabric on the grain, it keeps it exactly on the grain. You don't have any stretching, and you can also get a much tighter stretch on your fabric, which is what you need for something like tambour embroidery. So if you have the money, highly recommend. I think they're not that much. They're like maybe $30 or something like that for the slate frames. One blade, I think I forgot to put it at the end, or maybe it's at the end, we'll find out. But where to get those slate frames is Lacis. That's one place, LACIS. They have tons of embroidery supplies. They are really, really great. Their website looks like it's from 2001, so don't worry. But the quilting frames in the middle, those are really great to get they're also really good for portability because they come apart. So if you don't need something under super high tension, they are good for carrying around projects, and you can just snap them together and snap the thing on and then go. Okay, next. So here's an example of when I was working on a giant embroidery project where you can see that on the right side of the first image, that's where I've basted the fabric to that twill tape, and then the other end is the twill tape has been wrapped around the stretcher and basted to the fabric, and I did that so that I could move it further on because the piece was a skirt piece. It was really, really big. So I just basted it, did all the embroidery, and then took it off and then rebasted it for the new section. You can also pin in a pinch, but with the pins you have to be careful while you're working, to not stab yourself. So that is how you can, and this was like stretching my frame to its limits, but there's only so big that you can work before your arms cannot reach. So you don't want to make your frame bigger than you can reach with your arms because there's no point. Okay, next. Okay, so when you're embroidering, stabilizers are not always necessary. Like for tambour embroidery, you're not using any stabilizers. But if you're doing any kind of dense embroidery, and this is mostly talking about hand embroidery because I have not yet dipped my toes into machine embroidery, so I don't know a whole lot about it. But there are different types of stabilizers you can use. They work differently. Some you remove with water, so obviously if you're removing it with water, your embroidery and your fabric need to be able to be washed. Another really good tip for stabilizing that is not a stabilizer is if you have a very soft, shifty fabric like chiffon, flavorless gelatin. You dissolve some in water, swish your fabric in it for like half an hour, or just let it soak, and then let it dry. And it will stiffen up the fabric just enough to make it no longer shifty and horrible, and then you can rinse it out when you're done. So a lot of the time for things like gold work, I will basically just I'll frame up a piece of like muslin or like a stable plain weave cotton, and then embroider on top of that. That is another thing you want to keep in mind when you're doing heavy embroidery motifs. Usually don't want to do it on your actual garment if it's like really dense, because it's going to pull on the fabric and it's going to distort your fabric. So for really heavy embroidery and gold work, I usually like to do it as an applique. So you do it first and then you put it onto your fabric. And that also means that it can be removable if you ever need to like wash your garment. Okay. Next slide. Oh, yes. So, like I said, I haven't personally done a lot of machine embroidery. I just recently got a machine that can do embroidery. So when I gain my copious spare time, I need to figure out how that thing works. So with machine embroidery, you have to use stabilizers. You need to do test runs. Things will mess up. And from what I understand, broken threads are a fact of life. It can be expensive, but it's the pro is that you can get really fancy things that are not going to take you 2 years to embroider. So I really enjoy the process of embroidery, of hand embroidery, but I still am absolutely going to use the machine for things where I want to have something done in less than 2 years. So this is an example of a 18th century jacket waistcoat pattern that has been machine digitized and sewn. Okay, next slide. One fun thing you can do with machine embroidery is freestanding lace. There are patterns that you can download for this. You can design your own patterns as well, but you have to be really careful with the design of those patterns, because the thing about freestanding lace is that the stitches have to really overlap and intersect with each other, like really, really sturdily, because it is the stitches. That's all that's holding the thing together once you rinse out the stabilizer. So you're stitching onto wash away stabilizer. And then once you wash away the stabilizer, the stitches, if they're not really well interlocked, the whole thing will just like dissolve into a pile of threads. So you really want to make sure that the design is very, very structurally sound. But you can do really, really cool things. Yes?
Can I just add something?
Yes, please.
If you're still learning how to figure out freestanding lace, you can embroider on something like tulle or chiffon.
Yes. That's a really good idea. Because in a lot of cases, it doesn't actually have to be freestanding. If you embroider onto like tulle, it's going to be almost invisible anyways. So yeah, absolutely. Okie doke. Next slide. So yes, as mentioned, hand embroidery can be very relaxing or tedious depending on your personality. One thing that a lot of beginners don't realize is when you get the embroidery floss at Michael's or the craft store, as you buy it, it is usually not meant to be used just like that. It has multiple strands in it, and you're meant to divide those strands and use them as like how dense or thick the stitch you're trying to do is. So usually you're not going to use all 6 strands at the same time. You're going to use like 1 or 2. If beyond the standard cotton embroidery floss, you're not going to be able to find a lot of supplies locally at Michael's or other stores. If you're lucky enough to have a store that specializes in embroidery stuff, good on you, but most of us don't. So a lot of the tools you're going to have to buy online. You don't need a lot of expensive things to do hand embroidery, fortunately. If you want to embroider with silk, obviously that's going to be a little bit pricier, but you can embroider with almost anything. Sadly, I don't know if we have any spots left in the goldwork and couching workshops, but one of my favorite things to do is couching, which is where you can lay a cord on top of the fabric and you're stitching it down onto the fabric, and you can do that with almost anything. I love to use a lot of really inexpensive craft cords that are just glittery. And, I just get those from the craft store. They don't cost a lot of money, and they look really, really nice. And so, like anything that looks cool, if you lay it onto the fabric, you can often couch that down, layer different trims and things for a really fancy effect. And the I think it's the Royal School of Needlework has a stitch bank online where they have like a list of like hundreds and hundreds of different embroidery stitches. Once you get started, there's so many different stitches. I don't know even a tiny fraction of them. And most of them you're probably not going to use in cosplay. Like a lot of them are very specific for like making a particular type of flower, but it's still cool to experiment with. So this on the right, that was my Princess Leia Bespin dress. That was, I think, my first really big embroidery project. I put that in a bag and carried it with me for 6 months. And that's all done. It's mostly done in chain stitch, I think, if I recall correctly. Chain stitch is extremely useful. Next slide. So here we go. Yeah. So here are some basic stitches. There are, like I mentioned, there are a million, so you will not learn all of them, but these are some really, really useful ones. Chain stitch on the top left, that is a really good outlining stitch. It's also good for filling. For tambour embroidery, what the tambour needle is doing, it's basically doing a chain stitch through the fabric, but with a little hook. So it's kind of like crocheting and chain stitch at the same time. I mentioned the couching on the bottom left. So you can see in that photo, the gold cords have been stitched down onto the top of the fabric. And so a lot of things that won't pass through easily through the fabric, like a lot of metallic cords and threads are a pain in the ass if they're passing through the fabric a whole lot of times, because the metallic coating is going to strip away and it's going to shred and it's going to tangle. So any any threads or cords that are a pain in the ass to put through the fabric, you can just lay them on top and couch them down. And then long and short stitch, this is really good for thread painting, creating ombre effects. I think if I recall correctly, the next slide is probably talking about satin stitching. So long and short is good if you have an area that you need to fill. Basically, you don't want your stitches to be too long if you're doing something like that, because they'll be loose and they'll catch on things, anything that can snag. So if you have to fill a larger area, you want to do something like long and short so that none of the individual stitches are going to be super, super long. Okay, next. Yes, here we go. Exactly. So one thing I see a lot of when people are just starting out with embroidery is people assume that they have to do a satin stitch. Satin stitch is not the be-all and end-all. And again, you don't want to go over too large of a space with one stitch, because it's not going to stay in place. It's going to shift. It's going to look messy, and it's going to snag. So you want to break up your motifs. If you want to do satin stitch, you want to break up your motifs and have maybe like a dividing line down the middle, like the one on the top right. That's got a dividing line down the middle. And also, a lot of these look better with padding underneath. You can use felt. You can use cotton cord. Or you can just do some like, say, chain stitches underneath and then do the satin stitch on top. So this, again, a lot of this stuff takes practice. It takes a lot of practice. Do not be discouraged if your first attempts look like crap, because that's normal. Okay, next. So couching cords and gold work. Again, this can be expensive if you get the real the stuff that has actual gold content. You do not have to. I don't. I usually get all my gold work stuff from India. It is 100% mystery metal. It will, all gold work materials, just as an FYI, will tarnish over time. That is the nature of the beast. You want to keep it away from humidity. You want to keep it away from sunlight. Store it in a good place. Over time, it will tarnish. That's just how it's going to be. But all these things, like anything that is too textured or heavy to go through the fabric, again, you can couch it on top. Okay, next. So here are some brief examples of goldwork materials. So this one on the left, the pearl, This is often used for outlining. It is, a lot of these are springy, but this one is, it's like a spring that's kind of stiff. And so you basically pull it slightly to stretch it a little bit before you couch it down so your stitches can go in between those little coils. The passing thread or Japan thread, we saw that earlier, where it's like a cotton core with a metal sort of wrapped around it to make it shiny, and then you stitch it down, you couch it down. The one on the bottom right, it's a technique called or nuée, which means shaded gold. And so you're couching it down, but instead of trying to make your couching stitches invisible, for where the flower is, they basically used colored silk threads to couch the gold cords down and create a motif just using those couching threads. So it's sort of stitching it down and creating a picture at the same time. Okay, next. So metal threads, there's a million of them. A really good sort of overview of what the types are and what they're used for, you can find at Berlin Embroidery. At the bottom there it says berlinembroidery.com. She's in Canada. She also sells a lot of these. I don't necessarily buy a lot of her stuff because she mostly sells the actual gold stuff, so it's a little bit pricey, but she's a really, really good resource. Oh, yeah, and as mentioned, if you're going to do goldwork motifs, again, you're going to usually want to do it as an applique that you can put on your garment, and I would not recommend heavy goldwork on like flowy hems because it's not going to look good. So you want to put it on like cuffs, collars, anywhere that has some structure already. Okay, next. And this is the kind of thing, again, that you see on military uniforms, on religious vestments. That's, like, because things already have some structure, that's where you can put a whole crap ton of gold on there and it's going to look nice. And one thing when planning your goldwork motifs is ideally, you can see here these ones, there's a lot of variety of texture and different types of threads, because we saw there were some that are smooth, some that are sparkly, some that are rough, and different shades. So you don't want it to all be the same. You're going to have a much more beautiful effect if you have variety of, like if you alternate a shiny and a dull one to give a bit of visual interest. Or like on this uniform here, you see some of the leaves are shiny, some of them are not shiny. You've got some that have sequins running down the middle. So you get like a lot more visual interest that way. Okay, next. And as mentioned, my beloved super cheap glitter craft cord, all of this is done with glitter craft cord that's couched down to silk. So, you do not have to break the bank to get really fancy effects. That's just craft cord and beads for all that, because the original design had this ridiculous lace that does not exist in reality. So I'll just embroider it. Okay, next. So once you have couched things down, what do you do with all this nonsense on the back? It is a pain in the ass. I hate it. It's my least favorite thing. I didn't bring my tool with me. So traditionally you use a hefty needle with a hefty thread, and you may just make a lasso and you yank all those cords to the back. So the one in the middle, they've finished those rows and they're going to have to yank those to the back. And then the top right is basically you need to stitch all those cords onto the back, and it is a pain in the ass. It needs to be done, but it's not fun. Okay, moving on. Next. So machine couching, you can also couch by machine. If you don't have all the time in the world. Also, one thing that to keep in mind when you're doing your embellishments is, again, what your fabric is that you're working on, and what the weight of the thing that you're applying to it is. So working by hand, you have a much more fine control of tension. So a lot of times if you have, say, a trim that's kind of stiff, and you're trying to apply it to a fabric that is less stiff, it can be really tricky to get the tension right if you're doing that by machine. So for situations like that, I usually like to hand sew it, because There's less problems with it puckering and pulling. Like you can do it by machine, but often you need to baste it first anyways, so I just like hand sew the sucker. But for fabrics that are more stable, then you can often get away with machine couching and machine embellishing, and it'll work out fine. Like, like cotton twills and things like that, or like a cotton velvet would probably be fine, or like a more medium to heavyweight polyester. You could probably, or again, if you are using stabilizer behind, you can often do like machine couching, and it's going to be a lot faster. So you can get couching feet, which you see here, where you can basically run your cords or trims right through the foot, and you can just zigzag over it. And there's also like decorative stitches you could do over top of your trims. You can layer trims, put them like 1, 2, 3 next to each other for a really cool effect. So you can see like on the bottom right, there's some really cool details you can get to just beef up your costume instead of just having a plain trim. Okie doke, next. So beads and sequins. Again, this is a whole process. You will need a lot of practice. Here you can see there's 2 different ways at the top right of stitching rows of beads onto your costume. You don't want to have too many beads in between each stitch, because then it's going to sort of sag and shift out of place and look messy. So my favorite is usually back stitching, but it's tedious. Faster is tambour embroidery. If you can get the hang of it, you can lay down beads really, really quickly. But again, that is a whole learning process. If anybody here has tried tambour embroidery and has struggled, that is normal. It takes a while to get the hang of the movement, and then it takes even longer to get any kind of speed. So that's fine. But once you get the hang of it, like some of the videos I've seen of like the Indian embroiderers, where they're just like, they're so fast, it's like watching a sewing machine. It's insane. But you can also, if you can get strung beads, you can just couch those down, like we did with the gold cords. Slung sequins, you can get sequins that are already stitched into a row, and you can just apply those by machine. Combining big beads with smaller beads is usually going to look better. Like if you have just like one big bead by itself, it tends to look a little goofy. So you want to plan your motifs so that like if you have like a big pearl, you might want to have like a little circle of like small gold beads around it or something like that to just make it blend with the rest of the thing better. Again, because like in anime or in manga, they're just going to draw a big pearl. And like that looks fine when it's illustrated, but in real life, it tends to look kind of clunky. So you want to modify the design that you're recreating in a way that looks nice in real life, and that looks nice to you and is scaled to your body, because these are all things that we have to think of when we're bringing something from 2D to 3D. So like if you need to make the size of the details bigger for you or smaller, or if the placement of that like patch of that fancy embellishment on the belt is a weird shape or weird size for you, it is absolutely fine to make it look good in real life, because you want your costume to look good on you, because none of us are 9 feet tall and a size quadruple 0. So, okay, next. So here's an example of poor life choices. So this costume, this is a replica of a costume worn by Sid Charisse in Singing in the Rain. And I made it out of spandex. And I beaded and sequined spandex. Do not recommend. Well, because like the dress needed to be spandex, and then I was like, well, it needs to be exactly the same color for all the details. So I interfaced the spandex. So all of those tabby things, those are all interfaced, but it was still a pain in the ass. Also, One thing to keep in mind when you're using bugle beads, the bugle beads are those, the tubey ones. They're like little tubes. Most bugle beads, there are some that are like the Miyuki Japanese brand that are super high quality, and they're very precise and they're less sharp. But a lot of the Czech bugle beads, they're basically just a tube of glass that has been cut. And so the edges of that tube are very sharp. So your your thread can, over time, the edge of that tube can cut your thread. So what I recommend when you're doing, if you're going to be working with bugle beads, is basically take a seed bead, because those are rounded, then a bugle bead, then another seed bead. And so just apply them like that, so the thread is going to be rubbing on the round seed bead, and it's not going to be rubbing on the edge of the sharp bugle bead. That's going to help a lot with the longevity of your beadwork. I did not do that here. Guess what's happening? Okay, next. Here are some more examples of cool, fancy shit. You can see a really nice combination of gold work and sequins on the right. And as I mentioned before, it's not just all a solid gold blob. We've got a lot of texture, we've got a variety of materials, and that's what makes it really pop. Okay, next. Here we have individually sewn sequins, because she's a crazy person. So again, these are different ways of interpreting this. She could have also interpreted this as, say, painted and then sequined, or you could interpret this as embroidered or applique. So this is one way of interpreting this fire motif. And if you want maximum sparkle, this is how you go. Next. Okay, tambour embroidery. So it's called tambour because drum in French is tambour. So the fabric needs to be drum tight. It is done in India as well with the name ari. And the difference with the French and Indian techniques is French is worked from the back of the fabric and Indian is worked from the front of the fabric. With the French method, you have your beads or sequins already threaded onto the thread, and you're basically bringing them up from underneath. And it allows you to lay down beads and sequins really, really quickly, but you can't swap them out because they're already threaded onto the thread. With the Indian method, they put the beads and sequins on the needle itself, and so they have to keep reloading their needle constantly, but it means they can swap it out, so there's a lot more versatility. So both methods are 100% valid, and they're really both good for different things. Yes?
What size seed beads?
Oh.
I know it depends on your needle.
Yeah. I think the thing is, okay, if you're doing Indian method, if you're doing the Ari method, I haven't checked the sizes. I probably don't think you can go any smaller than 11, maybe even 10. But if you're doing the French method where it's strung on the thread, it's like there's no limit because it's not interacting with the needle in any way. And so, yeah, normally with tambour, you're going to be working it on a sheer fabric like silk organza or tulle, and then you're going to cut it out and apply it as an applique. You can also just, if you have like a sheer section of your costume, you can do it you can tambour embroider on chiffon. Again, don't recommend, it's a pain in the ass, but if you stabilize it with the gelatin, it's not too terrible, but because chiffon is a lot less stable than a tulle or an organza, it's like hard mode. So the other thing that I learned on the French style needle, that's the one on the top where it has a little screw. I prefer that type because the screw tells you usually line up the screw with the hook. So when you're working with it, it's really important to know where the hook is because otherwise you're going to snag your fabric. So having the screw lined up with the hook makes your life easier. The Indian styles have no screw, so you just have to know. And so that takes a lot more experience to get those working. So I would start for beginners with the French style, unless you want to make your life harder. Okay, next. So here's some examples of what you can do with tambour embroidery. As you can see, it's it produces chain stitch. So basically on the on the side that you're working on, you're going to get the chain stitch, and on the side that you're not working on, like the other side, it's basically looks like a running stitch. So you can choose which side to work on it depending on what effect you want. Next. Okay, applique. So applique just means a thing that is put on top of another thing. And so any fabric can be appliqued. You can create your own fabrics and then applique those on. I really love applique because it can be best for large areas where you want a different color or different effect. You can layer things, and if you're not using a fusible to glue the fabrics together, it's not going to change the hand of your fabric, which can be very useful. Like if you're doing shears or very soft fabrics, fusing things is going to make it stiff, and that may not be what you want. So if you can applique one soft fabric to another soft fabric, it's not really going to change the hand very much. As long as, one thing to keep in mind when you're doing applique, you want the grain of your fabric to match up. This is very important because if you have one fabric off frame from the other, it's going to pull weirdly. So keep that in mind when you're planning your appliques and cutting them out. Have I always done this? No. Learn from my mistakes. So there's different ways to finish appliques. Hand sewn applique, you can just fold the edge under and stitch it with tiny invisible stitches. If you have a synthetic, you can just cut it with a hot knife. One of my favorite things to do for appliques is actually painting with a small brush the edges of where my applique is going to be cut out with either a matching or a contrast color of fabric paint, and then just cut along that edge. So the paint is going to seal the edge of the fabric, and then I'll just I'll just machine stitch or hand stitch that down, and it doesn't stiffen anything. It finishes the edges, and I really like to do that for a lot of things. A lot of people will machine satin stitch appliques. It creates a very smooth, finished edge that often works for a lot of anime costumes. But the downside of machine satin stitch is, again, you're doing a lot of stitches in a very small area, and so it can stiffen your fabric. So for fabrics that already have a lot of body, it's not a problem. But for things that need to be flowy, that may not be your best option. Yes?
Just adding, for machine satin stitching, it can also really mess with the fabric, depending on the choice that you make. I did machine satin stitching on a very slippery,
Yeah.
very drapey, and it would skip.
Yeah.
And I had to take the time to take cotton broadcloth and fuse it to my satin in order for it to embroider properly.
Yeah.
It was beautiful, but it was an extra step I didn't need to take. I made bad choices.
We all make bad choices, let's be honest. Okay, next. Oh, yes. I can't see you.
Which method do you recommend for the hand that's embroidered applique, where you're embroidering on a separate piece of fabric and then putting it onto?
Depending on, so if it's a gold brick applique, if it's on a muslin or something, I usually just fold the edges of the muslin under and just do a little tiny stitch along the edge, applique stitch. If it's a tambour embroidered motif on tulle or something, I usually just trim it close to the edge of the thing and just whatever is going to be the least visible. Yeah, there's no specific stitch. So here we can see some examples of totally different types of appliques. We've got fur with rhinestones. We've got pleather that's been top stitched, and then we've got satin with machine satin stitch. So the one on the right, this works really well because that sleeve has a lot of structure already. So the machine satin stitch is totally fine for that application. So you want to tailor what method you're using for your applique to what fabrics you're using. And also, one other thing about appliques, it's really great for if you need large areas that are a solid color, but you can also applique multiple, a fabric that's multi-hued, or you can, again, make your own appliques out of beads and sequins. So the limits basically are no limits with applique. It is one of my favorite things to do. Okay, next. Here's another really cool, this is heat cut and machine top stitched just along the edge. So because it's a synthetic and she used a hot knife, she didn't have to worry about it fraying. And so again, similarly to the fabric paint trick, if you're doing something to stop it from fraying, then you don't really have to go to the extra step of spending a million hours machine satin stitching it if you don't want to. Okay, next. Appliquing on sheer. I love this. It is really fun. So here we have some vinyl applique to organza. The one on the right was for my my Hades costume from Hercules, where it's silk crepe appliqued to a spider web netting, because I wanted to sort of like the hem to be like fiery with just little bits sticking out, and I was racking my brain how to make it so it would lay nicely when I'm standing still. I'm like, oh, I can just applique it onto something that's almost invisible. So highly recommend doing that. Also, for applique, you want these tools on the right. You want some wee scissors, and these are my favorite things. Those little pink ones, it might be hard to tell in that photo, but they're curved. So they're wee scissors that have a little bit of a curve, so you can trim around your appliques without worrying about cutting the fabric underneath. Those ones on the right, they're similar. I think they're called duckbill. They have like a little thing to basically hold the fabric out of the way while you trim. So everybody who's doing any kind of applique, you want some little wee scissors like that. Okay, next. Another thing you can do is layering fabrics. Layering shears creates such a beautiful effect. You can get so many variations of tone and texture and color. So here we have these beautiful pieces by Jacqueline Ward, who's a fantastic costumer, and she is like a master class in textile manipulation. So here you can see she's got all these different like shimmery fabrics and then layers of organza on top of them to create these gradations. So like just, let that percolate in your brain for when you need to do something that has like, an ombre effect. You don't have to dye it. You can dye it, but you can also do it with layering fabrics. Next. That's what I did here for this costume. It's kind of hard to see in here, but again, poor life choices. I layered multiple different shades of organza on top of a beige lining. And then I appliqued leather on top of that, like a smart person. As you can see in that second photo, I had to pad stitch the entire thing because the organza was very shifty. So yeah, I had to pad stitch the whole thing and then take all the stitches out later, but it can be done. So if you're going to be layering many, many layers of organza together, you're going to need to baste that sucker. Yes, next. Again, another project. So this one is the trick with drawing the outlines of fabric paint. So I drew all the scale patterns onto the gold fabric in fabric paint, and then I stitched down all of those lines onto the organza underneath, and then trimmed away some of the scales after stitching. So you have some areas that are translucent and some that are opaque. Next. HTV. HTV is, similar to fabric applique. It, can do similar effects, but it also is better for some things and not for others. So if you need something that is flat, there are some like 3D HTVs, but a lot of them are mostly flat. If you need something that is flat and is like all the same color, HTV is super great for that. It is super great for sci-fi type costumes. If you need like small lettering or motifs, things that have super clean edges, HTV is really great for that. If you need something that looks more organic or grungy or weathered or whatever, then HTV is probably not the one that you want to go for. But if you want something that looks really clean and crisp, HTV may be your best bet, and it's a lot faster than hand appliquing. Okie doke. Next, yeah. So you can see on the right all the little text designs would be a pain in the ass to paint by hand, but with HTV, it is much easier. One thing, you want to make sure that when you're designing your motif, it is mirrored, because the way that you look at it is not the way it's going to apply. So that's a easy mistake to make, it, and you end up with things backwards. So just keep it. Yes.
But also make sure you read carefully the instructions on the specific
Yes.
using, because every now and then
Oh my God.
one that doesn't mirror.
Wow. Amazing.
Yeah, it's fantastic. These 40 ones don't like to stick to fabric. They just don't.
Oh, great.
It's great. It's great.
And I haven't used HTV a whole lot, but from what I understand, like some brands are super wonderful to use and some are hot garbage. So like be very careful when shopping, get recommendations, do tests before putting it onto your final costume, because you may end up with a type that just is not working. And also some fabrics are going to be way easier to apply HTV on than others. Like I imagine there probably is a way to put HTV onto velvet, but I wouldn't do it personally. The vigorous head shaking.
May or may not work with some vinyl every once in a while.
Okay, next. Foils, similar with, so basically if you want something that does look more organic and grungy, doing foiling is probably, and you want it to be fancy and shiny, this is the way to go. These transfer gels you can use it with heat or without. And you can also use, like, there's 3D glues that you can get. So if you want like sort of your foil shiny outlines to be a little bit more dimensional, you basically just put down the glue and let it get tacky, and then you put your foil down. And so you can get really cool organic effects that way. Next. Fabric painting. Oh God, running out of time. Fabric painting, you want to use good paints. I recommend Jacquard brand. Cheap. You can turn any acrylic paint into a fabric paint by using a fabric medium, but you want to use tests. And also cheaper paints tend to have less pigment. So you're going to have less coverage. And so you may have to put many, many layers, and that's going to stiffen your fabric. So again, do tests. Some fabrics will just soak up paint like a sponge. Others, the paint will lie nicely on top. Things like crepe can be a pain in the ass to paint because the texture means that the paint goes on unevenly. So, do tests. Most fabric paints require heat settings, so you need to be able to you put an iron on it without it melting immediately. For flowy or stretch fabrics, we have an example we'll just be seeing in a second. Jacquard brand Dynaflow, or in Canada, G&S Liquid Colors. It's kind of a cross between a paint and a dye. So it brushes on and is liquidy like a dye, but it doesn't bleed. So it's really, really good for things that are going to stretch. So next slide. One thing you could do with puff paints is you can do imitation embroidery for a fraction of the time. You will end up with a permanent claw on your hand from gripping the puff paint bottle. But the collar there on this costume that's all little dots of gold puff paint. And the cape is all fabric paint as well. Next. So here we have spandex and silk cotton voile that have been painted with the liquid colors. So for something like this, unitard where you want to paint it, but it needs to stretch, those paints are a godsend, because that unitard was originally white. Okay, next. Batik and tie-dyeing works best on natural fabrics. You can do polyester dyes and stuff, but again, you're going to need to do tests. Dyes work differently on different fabrics. You want to make sure the thing about dye is you need to really be careful with your measurements. You need to do a lot of tests. It's chemistry. Some dyes will work really quickly. Some dyes will work slowly. And you want to use the right type of dye for the fabric that you're using, so do your research. Batik is really good, again, when you want a sort of crunchy, organic effect. And sometimes it's just not going to work. Like years ago, I was trying to do a batik on a fabric that was supposedly 100% cotton. It would not take dye, so I'm sure that it was not 100% cotton. So yeah, sometimes you're just going to have to do a bunch of tests, and maybe you might have to buy different dye, buy different fabric. It is a learning process because it's chemistry. Okay, next. Stenciling. Similar to, it goes along with fabric painting. So you can freehand paint or you can stencil. You can get a nice clean effect. This is like pre-HTV. One quick and easy way to make stencils is with freezer paper because it has that waxy surface on it. So you can basically just iron it to your fabric and it will stick temporarily. So you can make a stencil out of freezer paper and stick it down and then paint. It's like a one-use thing. You can't keep reusing it, but that's a quick and dirty way of making a stencil. Do a test though, because on some fabrics, the freezer paper will leave residue. Like I found that happened on when I was doing an applique onto that like wet look spandex. So the freezer paper left a sort of white residue on the wet look spandex. So just, do some tests. Next. Lace. Oh my God, I'm running out of time. Okay. Don't be afraid to Frankenstein lace. You can do anything to lace. You can cut up into little pieces. If you can't find the right lace, make your own. Just buy little bits and piece them together, paint them, dye them. Often when you're trying to recreate a character, the artist has just made up the lace out of their brain. If you can't find that exact one, make it work because chances are it does not exist in real life. Okay, next. So here's some examples of laces that have been modified. So you can see really cool, the ones on the right are all hand painted and pieced together. Next. Crystals and stones. E6000 is toxic. Wear your PPE for the love of God, please. I'm on some Facebook groups for people, for working with spandex. There's a lot of dance moms and skating moms, and all the time they're like, "Oh, I keep getting so dizzy whenever I'm stoning. It gives me a headache." Yeah. Personally, I love Gemtac because I live somewhere where I can't open the windows for half the year, so I'm not using E6000 most of the time. So yeah, Gemtac. Gemtac does get soft when you immerse it in water. It does not let go completely, but it does get soft. So, I wouldn't use it for synchronized swimming costumes. But otherwise, it's great. Glass stones are sparklier, but resin is cheaper. Glass stones are also heavier. So if you want to put a lot of sparkle onto something that is very sheer and lightweight and flowy, then you want to be careful. You're not going to be using the big ass stones and settings all along your hem because it's going to drag it down. So choose where you're putting the big ass stones somewhere that isn't going to be just dragging on your costume. Next. So here we have, my dress form often looks like some kind of pincushion. So I have appliques that it's mesh on mesh, and then I use the rhinestones with Gemtac to basically just glue down the appliques. So on the one on the right, I tacked down the stones with Gemtac and then stitched them down just for security because they're glass and so they're going to be pretty heavy. Next. Texture. I love texture. It's the best. So you can do a lot just by folding, ruching, manipulating. Huge visual interest. These are sheer fabrics that were, hand tacked down to create pleats and gathers. Next. Pleating. You can either buy a pleater board or make one. That thing on the left there, it's basically a little it looks like one of those window thingies. And Yeah, it's like window blinds, but you basically just tuck the fabric into the little louvers and then press it. And so you can make your own or you can buy one. Highly recommend if you need to make 1 million pleats. And once you have your pleats, you can also gather them, like I did in this skirt, because I needed 1 million things. Okay, next. Here we have some smocking. So that's the dragon scale type smocking that you see on Game of Thrones. We've got some quilting with the decorative stitch to make it even fancier. So your textiles do not need to be flat. You can get really fun with them. Next. Here we have some more smocking. So the one on the left, she's got the smocking on the bodice there. The one on the right, I made my snakes using the dragon scale smocking technique and then added some beads inside all the little thingies just because it was fun. Next. Quilting. Here's Jacqueline Ward again, the queen of quilting. This is like, it's just really cool. All of her stuff. And, oh, by the way, that costume on the left, the thing, all that came off and there was another costume underneath. Next. Combining techniques, because why use only one? So this one on the left, I forgot that HTV existed, so I appliqued metallic lycra like a smart person. It would have been way faster and easier with HTV, but it's fine. It's fine. So I've got applique, I've got couching cord, I've got sequins, I've got gold work, and similarly, those are both for the same costume, so I'm using a whole bunch of different things here. Next. Here we've got some Game of Thrones deliciousness with smocking, embroidery, and beading. We've got some extremely 3D embroidery on the right, which is really delicious. Next. This is a fun one. So this was a budget way to get a lavish look. So this is just layered applique with fabric paint. There's no embroidery here at all. But it looks like embroidery from more than like a foot away. So if you don't have the time to do like years of embroidery, that is a really, really good option. Next. And here we've got, like a combo of HTV ribbons and sequined appliques. And on the right, we have HTV. And then basically she sort of beefed up the HTV by chain stitching around the edges so it doesn't look quite so flat. That's another option. So you get the shine of the HTV, but if you want it to have a little more texture and dimension, then you can just, add things on top. I love to, for appliques, I like to edge my appliques with a couched cord just to have a little bit more 3D effect. Next. And the Lutavia's costume here has got literally everything and the kitchen sink. So we've got appliques of all those piecework to create that sort of stained glass effect. We've got batik, we've got shibori, we've got sashiko embroidery, gold folding, it's everything. And just the visual impact and texture is so cool. Next. So sometimes things don't work. My good friend Lenore on the right there, she used HTV for the gold on the hem of her skirt, but unfortunately she discovered that that skirt, the rayon, was extremely flowy and soft. And so the HTV combined with that very flowy rayon just did not react the way she wanted it to. She ran out of time, so she didn't have time to redo it. But if she were going to redo in the future, she probably would do an applique or something like that of a similar type of fabric, just so it would flow better. So yeah, with any of these, you want to test out first, and if it isn't working, just stop. It's okay. The whole thing is sunk cost fallacy. You're oh, but I've spent so much time in this already, I have to keep going. No, you don't. Sometimes you can just abort and say this is not working and then try something new. So that is absolutely valid. You have my permission. Okay, next. I'm writing. I have no time. Okay, so just take a screenshot of this. All these have different skill levels, different cost, different difficulty. Your mileage may vary depending on your skills, so you are the one who's going to make the decision for what's best for you. Okay, next. And here are your resources. A very small list, but these are things that I recommend. The Art of Manipulating Fabric by Colette Wolfe is one of the best books of all time. It is so good. It will make your mind expand. Like, it's real good. Okay, has everybody got it? Everybody got it? Okay, next. And we're done.